Hi, and welcome back to our APES Flipped Classroom as we approach the end of Unit 8 and the end of the year in AP Environmental Science. So today we're addressing issues with pollution and human health and with different toxins and pathogens that we can be exposed to. So we're going to talk first about health issues that are specifically linked to pollution, and then we're going to talk about different pathogens. So one of the things as we talk about pollutants is that it's really difficult to establish how toxic our different pollutants are because we're exposed to so many pollutants at any one time. And so it's almost impossible to study the effect of just one pollutant. We can be exposed by drinking or ingesting something. We can have lead enter our bodies through water pipes or through paint chips. Usually adult humans aren't eating paint chips, but small children are. We can be exposed to mercury by ingesting seafood. But we can be exposed to carbon monoxide by breathing it in. So when we have indoor combustion of biomass, particulate matter, again, we're exposed to simply by breathing it in. Arsenic, we usually are exposed to either by consuming it. It's actually a very common pollutant in rice, or by ingesting it by drinking groundwater that's contaminated with arsenic. And that might seem far-fetched living where we do. Arsenic contamination of groundwater is not a significant issue, but in the American Midwest and the American Plains states, arsenic contamination of groundwater is a very significant issue. And then the other complicating factor, besides the fact that we can be exposed to pollutants in so many different ways, is that we can have synergies. So we can talk about the we can't isolate the impact of one thing because the interaction of it with other substances can actually cause an effect that is greater than either of them individually. So as an example, asthma that's caused by particulate matter from coal particulate or coal power plants can be exacerbated by exposure to COVID-19, which then damages the lungs and the bronchial tubes. And so we have either one of those circumstances would be very negative for an individual, but the two of them combined is worse than the sum of the parts. In the same way, asbestos, exposure to asbestos causes mesothelioma. We're going to talk about that in a few minutes. But when you combine that with lung damage from smoking, it makes both of them worse. So these synergisms make it really hard to pinpoint the exact effects of one specific pollutant on humans because we're exposed to so many pollutants at one time, and because those synergistic effects can make it difficult to determine exactly what's causing the problem. Okay, so now we're going to talk specifically about 3 pollutants and what their impact is on humans. Later on, we're going to come back to pathogens, but College Board includes dysentery as a pollutant. So we're going to talk about this one kind of in this part of the unit. So what is dysentery? It is a bacterial infection that's caused by food or water that is contaminated with fecal matter. Usually this is, dysentery is much more of a problem in the developing world because of lack of treatment of sewage. But if you have an inadvertent sewage release into rivers or streams that are used for drinking water, then that can cause dysentery even in relatively developed nations. But most often this is common in developing nations where there is not treatment for sewage. So dysentery causes intestinal swelling, can result in blood in feces. It results in diarrhea, which causes severe dehydration. And if this patient then drinks more of the contaminated water, that just continues to exacerbate the problem. So dysentery kills 1.1 million people annually, again, mostly in developing countries with poor sanitation, limited access to water filtration. Dysentery can be treated with antibiotics that kill the bacteria, and access to clean water because that rehydration process has to be with clean water. Okay. Second one that is related to pollutants is mesothelioma. So mesothelioma is a type of cancer that is caused by exposure to asbestos, and it primarily affects the respiratory tract, the heart, or occasionally the abdominal cavity. So people who worked with asbestos and breathed in the asbestos fibers are exposed. And so it used to be very commonly used in shipyards and in the construction industry. Now, most of the exposure comes from removing that old insulation, because when that insulation is disturbed, those asbestos particles are released into the air and inhaled. It used to be, like I said, very commonly used in shipyards and construction of industrial buildings. And so many years ago, those people were exposed in the construction process. This means that if a home or a building or a ship is contaminated with asbestos, that removal has to be done by professionals with proper training and equipment that prevents them from inhaling the asbestos. In addition, that area has to be sealed off from other areas in the building and ventilated so that anyone coming by, no one can come through that space and breathe in the asbestos, and people coming by are not exposed either. And so we always want to replace insulation with non-asbestos insulation. It's not just insulation. It was also used in floor tiles. It was also used in wallboard. It was used in shingles on roofs. So there's asbestos in a lot of different locations. And this is just an image of someone geared up to properly remove asbestos. Okay, and we've talked about this one before, so we're just going to briefly touch on tropospheric ozone. So we remember that tropospheric ozone worsens respiratory conditions like asthma, emphysema, bronchitis, COPD, or chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, which is what COPD stands for. This means that it limits overall lung function by irritating the muscles of the respiratory tract, which causes the airways to constrict, and it causes a shortness of breath. It is also an eye irritant. And where does it come from? Photochemical breakdown of nitrogen dioxide that comes from mostly car exhaust, but also coal and natural gas combustion. Remember that vehicles are the largest contributor to nitrogen dioxide. Remember, tropospheric ozone is ground level ozone. That's down where we are. We breathe it in. It's dangerous for us. We want ozone in the stratosphere. That's where it protects us from UV light. The computer's not wanting to cooperate. All right. Okay. So you have a practice FRQ here. So pause and answer your practice FRQ. Again, all about these different sites and what we would find in the different sites downstream from different pollutants. But we're going to keep moving on, and we're going to talk about pathogens and infectious diseases. So College Board expects you to know a lot of pathogens. Okay, so we're going to talk about pathogens, and we're going to talk about vectors. So a vector is a way that a pathogen is spread. So what is a pathogen? It is a living organism that causes an infectious disease. This can be a virus, it can be a bacterium, it can be a fungus, a protist, or a worm. Infectious diseases can be spread or transmitted. Non-infectious diseases are not transmissible. So an infectious disease is something like HIV or the common cold. Non-infectious disease is something like heart disease or asthma. Those are things that can't be transmitted. Pathogens adapt and evolve. They take advantage of humans as hosts for their reproduction and their spread. COVID-19 is a great example. It is a SARS-associated coronavirus that has evolved. It is especially effective at surviving and reproducing in humans. We've heard in the last 3 years of at least 4 major variations on COVID-19. So we know that it's very, very good at adapting and taking advantage of us. A vector is something that can carry infectious pathogens and transmit them to other organisms. Mosquitoes are one of our most common vectors, but if you guys think back to the Black Plague in Europe, rats or other rodents are also very common vectors. How is this related to environmental science? Well, as our climate changes and we're shifting those equatorial climate zones north and south away from the equator, this means we get warmer temperatures in our subtropical and our temperate regions, which means that we have more vectors. Mosquitoes can spread farther north. They can exist for longer. The summer becomes longer and those mosquitoes have a longer reproduction period. So these warmer temperatures are actually allowing pathogens and vectors to spread north and south to parts of the world that were too cold before. When we think about El Nino and the way that it changes weather patterns in South America and in the Pacific, it can increase the number of vectors, it can increase the number of mosquitoes because of rain or because of warmth. Most pathogenic bacteria and viruses survive better in warmer weather. So we have more vectors, but we also have a better environment for growing those bacteria or those viruses. So this is just an example. This is showing the expanding range of Aedes aegypti, which is the mosquito that carries the Zika virus, yellow fever, and dengue fever. So we can see that from 2019 to 2080, we are increasing the amount of mosquito habitat. Okay, so let's talk about the relationship of infectious disease and development level of nations. So our less developed, our poorer countries typically have higher rates of infectious disease. There are lots of reasons for this. One major reason is that there's less sanitary waste disposal. When we have open waste areas, pathogens have more ability to reproduce. Children are likely to play there, or animals might scavenge there and become vectors. So there are more transmission routes. In addition, there's less healthcare access. And so the infectious diseases that in the developed world might be treated quickly and prevented from spreading to anyone else are going to run through communities and be passed from one person to another. Another major issue is clean drinking water. Because there is a lack of sewage treatment, because there is a lack of access to clean drinking water, people are exposed to bacteria and to viral pathogens in the water. We've talked about the fact that everyone is drinking upstream waste. And here in the developed world, where that waste goes through a sewage treatment plant and passes lots and lots of tests, it's not a big deal to be downstream of a sewage plant output, but where people are simply dumping toilets into rivers, that's not exactly the same thing. And then tropical climates. A lot of our poorer countries have tropical climates. There's more open air living, so people are more exposed to vectors like mosquitoes, and there's less money for vector eradication. So if you live in the city of Suffolk or the city of Chesapeake or the city of Portsmouth, they come around in the summertime, usually about once a week, and they spray for mosquitoes. That doesn't happen in the developing world, so there are more vectors and people are more exposed to them. Okay, so let's talk about the diseases that you need to know. So plague, yes, it's that plague, the Black Plague. So this is a bacterial infection that is transmitted by fleas. Those fleas attach to mice and rats. Those are also considered to be vectors. It is actually transmitted by flea bite or by contact with the rodent or by contact with contaminated human fluids. So it can be transmitted directly from the rodent to the human, or from rodent to flea to human, or from human to flea to human. So there's lots of different transmission ways. Modern antibiotics are highly effective against the Black Plague, but there are still occasionally isolated instances. Okay, tuberculosis. So this is a bacterial infection that targets the lungs. It is transmitted by breathing in bacteria from the respiratory droplets of an infected person. Those respiratory droplets are very, very fine. They can linger in the air for hours, so you don't have to be coughed directly on. Tuberculosis causes fevers, which then cause night sweats. People cough up blood. It is treatable in developed nations. It does require really, really strong antibiotics. It is the leading cause of death by disease in the developing world. There are about 2 million deaths, 9 million cases per year. COVID-19, which has been all the news, has only caused about 3 million global deaths per year. That's the entire globe, as opposed to the 2 million deaths that are just the developing world. Okay, malaria. This is actually caused by a protist, not a bacterium. It is a parasite. It's caused by an bite from infected mosquitoes. So mosquitoes, again, are the vector. Most common in sub-Saharan Africa, but it is also present in South and Central America, as well as areas of Middle East and Asia. Causes flu-like symptoms. It is most deadly in children under 5. The most common way of combating malaria is dealing with the vectors. It can be combated with insecticide spraying that kills the mosquitoes. The US eradicated malaria in 1951. Okay, West Nile virus, yet again, a bacterium that is carried by infected mosquitoes. Sorry, not a bacterium. West Nile is a virus. The main host are birds, but the virus can be transmitted to humans by mosquitoes, transmission from the bird to the human. It causes brain inflammation, which can be fatal. Another virus carried by infected mosquitoes is the Zika virus. This one can also be transmitted by sexual contact. It can also be transmitted from mother to fetus. Zika virus doesn't have a major impact in the people who are, the adults who are infected by it, but it causes babies of mothers who had Zika while they were pregnant to be born with abnormally small heads and damaged brains. So there is no known treatment for Zika virus currently, so the prevention is focused on eliminating the mosquito populations in areas where Zika virus is prevalent, which is mostly South America. Okay, so SARS, you might have heard of this one because SARS is a coronavirus. It is an infection. It's caused by it's transmitted by respiratory droplets from infected people. It is whether those fluids are touched and then transmitted or inhaled. It causes a form of pneumonia. So coronavirus, or the COVID-19 virus, is a form of SARS. The initial SARS outbreak was in Southeast Asia. SARS-CoV-2 is the COVID-19 virus. So that's SARS. Then we have MERS, which is the Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. Again, this is viral. It is a respiratory infection. This one is transmitted from animals to humans. So SARS is transmitted from person to person, but MERS is transmitted from animals to humans. And it originated on the Arabian Peninsula, hence its name, Middle East Respiratory Syndrome. I believe that camels are considered to be the originating species for MERS. Okay, then we have cholera, which is a bacterial infection that is caused by drinking infected water. So now we're not talking person to person or vector. This is caused directly by drinking infected water, much like dysentery. And again, much like dysentery, cholera causes vomiting, muscle cramps, and diarrhea. Dysentery, usually not the vomiting and the muscle cramps, just the diarrhea. And it causes severe dehydration. It can be introduced by water contaminated with human feces. It can also be transmitted by eating seafood from water contaminated with cholera if it is undercooked. So why does location matter? Our developed countries and our developing countries have very different risk factors. Location matters when it comes to pathogen transmission. In developed countries, our level of urbanization means that things can spread really, really fast. High use of service industries and the concentration of population allows for that faster spread. One outbreak at a daycare center, suddenly all the parents are sick, then all of their coworkers are sick. Everybody that they sat with on a train going to and from work is sick. So that concentration of the population allows for a fast spread. But in developed countries, if it is something that is treatable with antibiotics, it can usually be stopped relatively quickly. In developing countries, the risk factors are primarily access to clean water or lack of access to clean water. But another major risk factor in developing countries is that exposure to vectors, particularly insects. Globalization, as we've seen with COVID-19, has increased the risk for everyone because pathogens can move around the world very quickly by using humans as their hosts. Okay. Practice FRQ. Looking at this map, I want you to make a claim about a region of the world that likely has a high incidence of cholera. And you can see that this map tells you about the share of the population with access to improved or clean drinking water. All right, that's it for today. As always, let me know if you have any questions. I look forward to seeing you in class.